Thank you. Um, this meeting today will be the first of many meetings in this year's budget cycle. It'll be the first budget cycle for some of our board members. So, as we've said before, it'll be a little bit like drinking from a fire hose. However, today's meeting is just much more of a broad overview of what we're going to be seeing in this budget. And you're going to notice in this first look that there are some themes that kind of stick out in this big picture. The first one is we are going to be dealing with some uncertainty. And most of you have already heard from the governor and some of our legislators about the state structural deficit. And so that will be playing into our budget this year. And we will discuss that in some detail a little bit later. Also, we have some local level concerns about inflationary impacts in many areas, as well as our lack of enrollment growth. So between inflation and not growing and being pretty much status quo for enrollment, that puts us in a tougher budget position. And we also want to discuss kind of modifying our budget timeline, since the governor will come out with his budget, and that will let us know basically where we're going to stand as a state and what might happen. It might tip the hat about what might happen with Blueprint as well. Speaking about Blueprint, we have ongoing challenges with Blueprint implementation that we'll talk about as part of this budget process, both in terms of the near budget planning that we'll discuss today, as well as the Blueprint fiscal restrictions that will impact the way we operate our schools. So the Blueprint will have an effect on us in two different ways. And then we'll need to talk about, with Blueprint, meeting our existing obligations that we have set up and agreed to. And finally, I'll just say that, we've been having internal conversations, and I think it's time during this budget cycle that we start having some serious discussion about the expectations of Carroll County Public Schools. Because as we look down the road at Blueprint, as well as with funding, if funding for our students or our per pupil changes, or the constraints that we have in order to meet student needs changes, then that's going to impact our ability to have our students achieve historically where they have been able to achieve. So I know that's not something that we like to talk about. I think we are a very efficient organization, and we've always gotten good results. And I won't say but, I'll say and, we have to be realistic with one another as well, as we're living within the constraints that we have. So before I turn this over to Mr. O'Neill and Mr. Burke to start the presentation, I'll say, today is a day to just listen, let the information sink in a little bit. And I know that some questions, of course, questions will bubble up today, and please feel free to ask questions as we go through the presentation. But also know that as you leave today and as you think about the presentation, it's going to be very normal for more questions to start coming up, and we'll be able to get into those as we move forward, because we have many meetings and discussions that will be a part of this budget cycle. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. O'Neill.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McCabe, and good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. McCabe said, this is just the first step in what will become a long budget process. And just for everyone who might be watching's clarity, this is not the presentation of the superintendent's budget. This is just a discussion of some of the major concepts as we look forward to Dr. McCabe presenting her budget to the board sometime in the January timeline. And we will end this presentation, or our last slides at least, talk about what that timeline might look like, especially in a time where there's a little bit more uncertainty than in prior budget years. And so our plan, and we're flexible for your needs, but our plan is that Mr. Burke will present most of these slides to you. We'll try to move as quickly as possible. I'll interject periodically. Mr. Shockney may want to interject periodically, just enough to throw off his rhythm. But you can ask questions as we go, or if you prefer, we can present, and then you can jot your questions down and ask them all at the end, or have discussion, or however you want to handle it. So we'll start with Mr. Burke. Is it going to click from here?
Yeah, I got it. There we go. So, good afternoon. As we're developing the fiscal year 26 budget, we going to take a look here at the revenue side, get a feel for what we anticipate being available as we come into the process. On the local side, our county revenues are based on the county's adopted operating plan. So during their budget process last year for fiscal year 25, they adopted an operating plan that included $7.2 million of additional funding for fiscal year 26 for the system. And the superintendent's budget, as we develop it, will be based on that amount. Superintendent committed during the process last year to working within that amount, and so our requested increase from the county will be in line there, $7.2 million. So one number we have some certainty as we point to, and we'll continue to work through. When we look on the state side, however, that's where it gets a little more, a little more difficult. We continue to phase in the blueprint formula funding, year 3 of that, and so we anticipate use a process to try to anticipate state aid, and some of the numbers we have will be based on that. One major component is enrollment, and I'll ask Mr. O'Neill to go a bit into that. That story is not quite what we hoped.
Yeah, so this is one of those themes. This is one of those places where we want to just sort of pause on the budget discussion and talk about this factor, because this factor has implications for planning for fiscal 26, potentially for out years as well. It also sort of has a retrospective concern here, because I think partially last year around this time, when Mr. Burke just referred to, at least at the superintendent's level, Dr. McCabe had made a commitment verbally to at least one of the commissioners when they asked about last year's budget, if sort of the question was along the lines of, if we were to be able to fund you above our plan this year, for the year we're now sitting in, would you be asking for more next year? And we'll make the distinction now and at the end. You know, her budget proposal is different than your budget request. You have your own independent action as a board, but at her level, she said, yes, that would be my, my commitment. Part of our belief at that time that was sort of a viable place to be, and that is still her commitment, don't get me wrong, but part of the thinking then was, we knew what was in the county plan, and that's a fairly consistent number year over year of growth. And at the state level, last year from fiscal 24 to fiscal 25, that year change was one of the smallest increases in the targeted per pupil that drives state funding, but the fiscal increase from 25 to 26, so this year into next year, is one of the larger increases in targeted per pupil funding. That fact, with the fact that we were also anticipating, based on our enrollment projections, somewhere around 370 more students, although some of those are pre-K projected students, so they're not funded. They're not part of the funding formula. So somewhere more like 270-ish, 280 K through 12 students that would be factored into the state funding formula. We thought those two things together could make it a workable outcome. So a bigger increase in state aid on the per pupil amount, and an increase in student enrollment around 200 and, let's say, 75 kids. That didn't happen. So our enrollment, now certified by the state, is basically statistically flat. And so even backing out pre-K, which is its own thing, we ended up 18 students higher in terms of students that the formula funds on than the prior year. So we did want to take some time on this on purpose because we've done a little bit of research. We think we have a pretty good feeling for kind of what's underlying this. At the same time, I also didn't want to, I at least wanted to be able to proactively address it, so hopefully a narrative doesn't develop that something is wrong with our projection process. I don't believe that that's true. It's a big problem for this discussion, but in the grand scheme of statistics, that's being off by about 1%. And there's a whole lot of factors that go into projecting enrollments, and we think we know what the factor is, but to sort of walk through them a little bit. One part of it is birth rates, historic birth rates. They certainly didn't change. Whatever the birth rates was 5 years ago was still the birth rate number, so that's not new or different. We have access to data on number of students being homeschooled and number of students who live in Carroll but who are educated in private schools. And even though we don't have some of the final state reports that will eventually come out, usually around February, on those two data sources, we do have access to the underlying data. So it's kind of like, even though we have to wait for the state to certify enrollment, we know the numbers we turned in before they certified it. So even though we don't necessarily have all those reports, we're not seeing a dramatic increase in homeschool students or private school students. So those two elements don't seem to be a factor. And that sort of makes sense because our overall number of students didn't go down. We don't have fewer students. We just don't have as many more students as we believed we might have. And so to the best of our ability to sort of do the research and try to come up with some explanations, what we do have is the other factor is what I tend to call net migration, or what was the population change into and out of Carroll County? What was the net of that? And if it's a net to the positive, how many of the families moving into Carroll County also brought students with them? That seemed to have been what was driving our enrollment increases that we had seen coming out of the pandemic and since then. And when you look at those numbers for the data we could access, the short story is net migration for the years that we can access from the Maryland Department of Planning. So those are real reports. And housing inventory sold in Carroll County have seen a pretty sharp decline in the last year, 18 months. And so from where we sit at the moment with what we have access to, we would say that net migration has clearly slowed down, at least for this time period in Carroll County. And that's tricky, and then it can have future implications, not just for fiscal year 26, but the years after fiscal year 26. So the algorithm that Mr. Kane, our facilities planner, uses to project enrollments accounts for all of those factors. And when there's a one-year blip, over time the algorithm will include that and sort of it'll smooth it out over time. So you know, the fact that we projected that we came in lower than we projected this year is factored into Bill's algorithm for the coming years. But if there's not sort of a return to house sales that we were seeing in 21 and 22 and early 23, then we're less confident that our enrollment projections for the year after and the year after might hold.
We're hoping that if inflation rates decrease,
Right.
people will feel better about moving again, or interest rates, inflation, people will feel better about moving around again, and we will see more families moving.
Yeah.
back.
And I should have said this, like clearly I'm not a demographer or whatever you might need to be really qualified to make these kinds of assessments. But it is possible it could turn pretty quickly. It certainly turned this way fairly quickly, and perhaps it could turn back, and maybe interest rates do have a lot to do with that. But it's harder to say now with confidence it's harder to say we have the same confidence in next year's projections that we would have had before this happened. Ultimately, the formula takes care of it, but when you're trying to look from one budget year to the next, it's just a caution that we're talking about right now. And we'll monitor and go from there. Certainly in looking at 26 planning, it's an impediment, and it's an unanticipated issue to work through, and it adds to sort of that overall theme of uncertainty that Dr. McCabe opened this session with. So just a little bit of background on on enrollment because we thought it probably merited its own conversation separate from just a quick glimpse through as to what it meant for budget. And like I said, questions at any time, but if not, we'll continue to move forward. So Mr. Burke will pick it up from there as to what it means for state revenue.
Right, so the impact of all of that, enrollment, the targeted per pupil amount increasing in the state formula, our best estimate using our tools right now would be an increase in the neighborhood of 10.8 million for fiscal year 26 over fiscal year 25. That is all of the state revenues, the blueprint revenues. Some of those are restricted by use. So specifically, we're focusing on the 6.1 million, the component of the 10.8 million, as being less restrictive revenue available for our overall operations. And so that's what we'll focus on, but we'll also see an increase in our restricted funds as well.
One last thing to say about enrollment, probably to put a bow on it. Rob was probably looking for me to say it a minute ago. Even though our overall enrollment is statistically flat, within our enrollment, we did see some sizable changes in certain populations. So we saw a fairly significant increase in students who are identified as compensatory education students, and we saw a proportionately similar increase in multilingual learners, or sometimes we might still say ESOL students. And so the overall number didn't change, but who the students are changed a little bit measurably in those areas. And the conversation he just had about how certain blueprint patterns of funding are restricted, this is not a comment on the students. We love all of our students, but in terms of how the blueprint funding requirements work, that doesn't give us any greater flexibility. It's sort of, we'll talk a little bit more in a minute about fiscal compliance, but it adds an element to, a different way of looking at budget under blueprint fiscal compliance.
Do we know how many students come from in-state or out of state?
In terms of just the net migration, people moving into
Right, because
Carroll
I was
County?
wondering if it's like an educational thing, like people want to come to Maryland or people want to come to Carroll County.
I'm not sure that I do. I'd have to look at the Maryland Department of Planning reports to see if they can tease out data at that level. But I'll make a note now to do so, and if we can have access to that, or if that does exist, we'll bring it back to the January budget discussions.
All right, thank you.
I think around COVID, it was definitely because we were one of the counties that opened up, and that drew a lot of the families to come to Carroll. Because I do remember hearing, like, we were seeing not a very large increase, but we were seeing new students coming in and families moving into the county from Howard and
Sure, and
adjacent areas.
that's a great point, and it sort of defied logic at the time. You would think in the midst of a global pandemic, maybe the housing market would tighten, or in the bad way.
Not in Carroll
not
County,
in
where
Carroll
it's so
County.
agriculturally, people wanted to have more land and spread out during COVID, so this was the draw.
Something was the draw, certainly, and like I said, I don't feel qualified to know exactly what, but in what I would call the two COVID years, we saw the most dramatic increases in positive net migration, 1,300 new residents each of those years, and units, like housing inventory being recycled or sold in over 2,000 units a year. And in the most recent 12-month cycle, only 900 residents new into Carroll County. So still positive growth, but not at the same level. And the number of units being sold is down by almost 1,000.
Could it also be that other counties redistrict? Because I know Howard County went through some severe redistricting eras. So I think a lot of Howard County students moved to Carroll County in that time.
I think it could be all of these factors, and I suppose for any single family, it's whatever factor led them here, or a combination thereof. But we did see tremendous growth in those years, and that's tempered quite a bit in the last 12-month cycle.
So continuing on the state, the theme of uncertainty with the state's structural deficit and the pressures on their budget, I would say we have even greater concern than usual on those projections of state revenue. Again, we'll know in mid-January, the governor's budget will come out. We're anticipating, certainly learning a lot more when that happens. We see some scenarios. If they lower the per pupil amounts, that really could have harm to us or help us. That really depends on how they identify which programs it is in, what the mix of restricted versus unrestricted funds is. So we'd have to wait and see on that. If they, relax any blueprint requirements, that could help us. That would probably be a more long-term solution. May or may not have much impact in fiscal year 26. So we've got really these two moving parts, as we mentioned, the financial pressures of a fiscal year 26 operating budget, and then, the separate issue of working through the blueprint fiscal compliance. We'll touch more on that later, but really both of these things are coming into play as we look at the state revenue mix. So a summary of those two, our local and state revenues, very preliminary. Again, this is our estimate, what we know today. 6.1 million in state foundation revenue, and the 7.2 million in our county request, 13.3 million in total increase. Obviously a number that in and of itself sounds and looks like a big number, but in our overall budget, not a substantial increase there. So these are, again, ongoing revenues. So these are what we're looking to base our ongoing operations on. We do some one-time expenditures with fund balance from time to time. We didn't mix that in here. We'll touch on that a little later and separately.
Mr. Burke,
Yes.
the previous years, if I remember correctly, there was times the county did not give us exactly what we had requested. Do you know by chance what that total might be, like from last year? So I know former board members, Donna Savigny would bring up the 1 year it was $4 million less. And so we were trying to make up for that in a little bit at a time as well.
Back a little before my time, so I'll
the,
defer on that.
The first year of the pandemic, sort of through mutual consent of the Board of Ed and the commissioners, they held us at maintenance of effort, which is what they legally could do. Enrollment was going up still, so it was some increase, but it wasn't what was in the county plan. So that probably, I'd have to go look now, but it probably would have been to the tune of $5-ish million that year. In years prior, which are so far in the rear view, it's probably not worth reliving that conversation. There were years in my tenure here, which is now 15 years, there were years that we were flat. There were years that we were at maintenance of effort, or if not at maintenance of effort, funded below the prior year. There were other years, especially more recently, other years where they were fairly consistent with around the 3% number of percentage growth that's in their plan. If you go back to, what would it have been, fiscal 19, I guess, the board worked with the commissioners to try to come up with sort of a longer term vision of what Board of Ed funding could look like. And I guess that would have been 19, because just as soon as we had landed on kind of a handshake agreement, if you will, on what a longer term vision of funding could be like, that's when the pandemic arose, and we immediately went to maintenance of effort by kind of general consensus. Yeah. So if you go, I guess it depends on your window of time. Certainly we have those data. It's been different over time, depending on factors and who was in office at that time, I guess.
Okay.
Am I stopping your
I'm
clicking?
not sure where I'm pointing. So on the expenditure side, we just touched on the revenues, move into the expenditures. Again, not laying out a budget tonight, but giving some idea of some of the pressures and expenditures that we're anticipating being challenges working through the process. Certainly the inflationary impacts, Utilities is a significant one, operation of our schools and all the buildings, the utilities costs there. We've been under some fixed contracts for a number of years and had some good experience. The term on those is coming up. We've been, the board's seen them as we've rebid those contracts over the last year or so, so we're starting to see the impacts of that now, really reset to market of the utility industry, and much as the rest of the world and the homeowners are feeling, we're chasing those costs up. Our operating insurances and employee benefits, we've been sort of chasing those costs up. Even if we're within national standards of inflation in those areas, sometimes those are inflationary costs, but on a plan our size, our employee base, that becomes millions of dollars and eats up at our revenue increases very quickly. A few other areas we're seeing some growth pressure in, special ed, typically sees increase as services are needed. As we're looking at usage in fiscal year 25 and some trend data, we're seeing some increase there. These are generally driven by requirements for service and laws behind them. Difficult for us to find a way not, that's an area we need to put resources. Technology, excuse me. We'll cover in more detail in a little bit, but certainly the devices, excuse me, that were added during the pandemic have, we're coming to that replacement cycle. We'll continue to see issues there.
It's choking Mr. Burke
I
up,
am.
just feeling the
Excuse me for a
inflation.
second. So those are some of the, excuse me, some of the knowns. As we look at some of the unknowns, obviously employee compensation, always a important and significant piece of our budget process. That'll be to be determined as we go through the process and work through negotiations. So, hanging out there above the process always. Additional blueprint requirements. Again, what might the state do there? A few things that we're still catching up to with blueprint. Some of these were new. We're still seeing the impacts of them, continued growth in whether dual enrollment and AP and pre-K. So we'll continue to have those costs coming as well. Other infrastructure needs in technology, security, maintenance, we'll touch a bit more on here in a little bit, but these are items that continue to impact us as we operate, as we have needs to replace and maintain our systems. So big items hanging out there will be challenging to work within our existing revenues there and tough decisions to be made. Additional blueprint items, hit on those.
Yeah, so where we've been sort of just, as we're getting ready to put together a budget to bring you on behalf of the superintendent in January, there's sort of an early glimpse of revenue, or what revenue could be, and then some of the preliminary items that Rob worked through with inflationary factors, and that alone probably will be a little bit challenging. And then to get to the other things, some of which are blueprint, from the previous slide, that largely that might be staffing. To get to compensation and staffing is a layer of challenge on top of that initial discussion. We also want to pause now because this is about to become a theme in January and into the foreseeable future to talk about a different part of blueprint and how it impacts not so much the budget planning in terms of planning for next year's budget and how much money will we, new money, more money, will we receive or not receive, and what do we do accordingly? But there's another part of Blueprint, which we typically will say fiscal compliance, or the restrictions, funding restrictions of the Blueprint, that is a little bit less about planning next year's budget or 2 years' budget and how much money you might have, and more about how you spend the money you already have. And that's really what Blueprint Fiscal Compliance is about. And so it's probably the type of thing that is its own work session eventually, or meeting. And it is just the timing of these two things syncing up in the same window of time is probably ripe for some general confusion among ordinary people, because it's the kind of thing that can be easily confusing. So when you come back after the winter break and have your January board meeting, we anticipate at that meeting to present to you a report of a committee that the superintendent formed at the turnover of the fiscal year, to sort of help us get our hands around how, as a school system, we can come into fiscal compliance under the Blueprint. And the state governing bodies, the Accountability and Implementation Board and the Maryland State Board of Ed, in I believe May, I think it was in May of 2024, co-signed, co-authored a joint policy that gives every Board of Ed in Maryland 3 years to come into full Blueprint fiscal compliance. 3 years including the year we're in. And so, very loosely, to summarize their policy, year one this year is that you make a good faith effort towards moving towards fiscal compliance. That's Dr. McCabe's work group and the report that you shall receive in January, hopefully. We come back the first day after break and try to wrap it up. And then in fiscal year 26, a system has to move sort of halfway to compliance from wherever its gaps are in each of the program areas. And then in fiscal 27, 100% fully compliant with Blueprint funding patterns. And the sort of the golden rules are that as the Blueprint, through the Blueprint formula, as we're receiving money for a purpose, for special education, for instance, for ESOL, for compensatory ed, or FARMS, also known as FARMS students, 100% of that funding received for that purpose must be spent on that purpose. 100% of special ed has to be spent on special ed services. 100% of ESOL on ESOL services, so forth and so on. And 75% of all of it must be spent at the school level, not at the central level. And we will be accountable kind of in two ways. One is we still have to produce the budget the way we've always had to produce it by major categories. They didn't change that law. But we also have to produce for the state sort of school by school budgets that show a budget that's compliant or moving towards compliant. And then on a monthly basis, starting this fiscal year and continuing forever while there's a Blueprint, Rob and Drew and our team in financial services has to report our expenditures as a system and at the school level to the state every month in a manner that hopefully shows that we are indeed tracking our expenditures in a way that's going to be compliant with that budget. And so we are not there. And this goes back to, this is the item that Dr. McCabe was out front with 2 years ago in her spring of 23 town halls. We know that we have fairly significant compliance gaps in many of the Blueprint programs, most especially compensatory ed, and that's a huge number, but also in other areas like ESOL or multilingual learners. And so there's not really a realistic way, at least I'll just speak for me right now, that I believe our county commissioners could or would fund us out of this, because they would sort of have to pick up the entire bill. They'd have to be willing to say, if our estimates are that it would take $45 million of resources to come into compliance, they'd have to bite that all off. Because, and this is kind of a nuanced point that I don't think we've necessarily touched on a lot in the past, but we will be in January and going forward. The Blueprint restricts state dollars and local dollars in those program areas. There is something called a state share of funding within each program area and a local share of funding in each program area. And this is the first time in my career, I guess I'd say, in my career actually spans before the Thornton formula. I was working in public schools from the change to Thornton and now to Blueprint. This is the first time that a state law for funding has restricted, in a meaningful way, restricted local funding as well. And so that also means, for instance, that if this is just a hypothetical, but if, as we begin to roll out our fiscal compliance report and what that would mean, and that's going to take time. There's going to be a report, and then there's going to be the details of that report as more and more analysis gets done. This is going to occur throughout the spring. But if it became clear that, well, in the overview of coming into fiscal compliance, this one school is really going to be impacted, even more than other schools, which are also going to be impacted. Because the Blueprint law restricts state and local funding to shares, there's also not a scenario where at a local level, the county government, if they chose to and wanted to be a partner, could say, you know, this is going to be so bad in our view for this school that we're going to give you a little bit of money to mitigate it at that school. That won't work because it will throw off the entire system formula for compliance. So it's pretty much it's kind of an all or nothing proposition, and it's hard to realistically say, well, there's another 40 million available to sort of fund the whole thing out. So it does go forward unless there's some change. And I know there's some talk about different things being changed, perhaps at the state, and we've referenced a few of those, the 60-40 time elements of the career ladder, perhaps some of the per pupil funding amounts. I haven't heard any conversation about this being changed, and it would require either both boards to change their joint policy or some sort of legislative remedy, and that's not a conversation we've been hearing. And so we're not in a position where we can sort of wish or hope that it might not happen. We do need to move forward with this plan in January. And so regrettably for you and the county as a whole, we're going to be having kind of these two conversations, FY26 budget and budget planning, and this Blueprint fiscal compliance plan as well.
The Blueprint fiscal compliance plan that Mr. O'Neill is talking about, as he said, is what I've been holding my town hall meetings on through the years. And this is where you'll see staff and resources moving throughout the system from certain schools to other schools. So that is something that we do need to move forward with, and that we have to hit a certain portion of compliance in for next year. And as Mr. O'Neill said, that will add complexity to this budget. And it will be difficult for, I think, our community to understand why we have to do certain things, and why certain remedies won't necessarily take care of the concerns.
Yeah, if I can share, there is some discussion with legislators on changing the formula a bit, trying to pour more into the foundation and taking slightly less out of comp ed, spec ed, MLL. But unless they get that through the legislature with emergency legislation and make it immediate, I'm not sure if it'll make much of a difference this year.
Yeah, and that's a great point. There are actually several great points there. And Mr. Burke alluded to this earlier. Changes to the foundation that go up are a very good thing for us.
Yes.
That's sort of where the most flexible revenue comes to us now from the state and the Blueprint. Changes to the other per pupil allocations in the Blueprint, even if they're less, given our compliance challenges, is actually really not that harmful to us. And I know we're having a funding conversation. We're not right now talking about services and needs of kids. Those are not, those things both exist. And Mr. Whistler, if the state's going to make any changes,
The funding
the
formula,
sooner
the better.
to know, the better, because it's hard to walk back change of this systemic level. I mean, this is significant change.
Yeah, another thing that I'm not sure we'll get much traction, but there is some discussion of lowering the comp ed from 75 to, people wish for 50. I doubt that's going to happen, but 75 to 60 is possible. But again, it all really depends on what the legislature will do. And again, if it's assigned emergency legislation, meaning it's effective upon the governor's signature.
And all of those kinds of things can be helpful to this process, because a change like that would thereby shorten the compliance gap.
Right.
But one thing, and hopefully this will become clear, and I know it's hard right now, we're not at that report stage. Hopefully it becomes clearer, at least as we start to report on this in January. But there are so many complexities that you might not just naturally think about that have to fall into place to make this kind of change happen. So whether it's all of the change we're presently anticipating or some portion of it, if the state made some revisions like that, to move that number of employees, there's a whole lot of conversations that have to happen in the Human Resources Office and with
Right.
the labor associations, and possibly even windows of collective bargaining that have to open and close and be settled. And so, anything that the state can do to share that news quicker than
Amen.
later helps.
There's two other things that I've heard discussion on. One is lengthening that 25 to 27, from 25 to 27 to 25 to 29, so give us more time to comply. There's a huge sense of urgency by many districts on not wanting to move teachers around because of that comp ed requirement. And then the other provision being talked about is the 60-40 split, either elongating that, mainly because of the teacher shortage. But yeah, it's going to be something that we're watching closely on the legislative committee.
Yeah. And we would welcome any of those things to sort of come onto our horizon. The only sort of it's little caveat I'd throw out for lengthening the phase-in period is there's a lot of moving parts, and figuring out how to align them all and time them and sequence them
Right.
is challenging even over a 3-year window.
Right.
So adding it, making it a 5-year window adds, not that it's not better, but it adds its own layers of, we got to maybe reshuffle the deck a little bit and figure out about how that would progress and how we would sequence certain things. So there's so many consequences to each of those items that any news that comes sooner than later is a positive.
Yeah, and again, I just want to underscore what you said earlier. People should not take this uncertainty as folks don't know what they're doing or they're not planning adequately, because that's just completely wrong. The level of effort that you're putting into it, Mr. Burke is putting into it, is monumental and intense. And from where I sit, I'm very comfortable with what you've done and what you're doing. And so I just really appreciate your efforts.
Thank you. Okay.
I've got a question on the staff. So when we're realigning school resources, like reshuffling teachers, do schools have the autonomy to decide what teachers are getting shuffled, or is that a Board of Education or like Carroll County?
It's, so there's, that's also a very complex question. So processes and procedures for movement, assignment of employees are typically part of a negotiated agreement with unions. And that's less of the substantive decision of who might get moved or where you get moved, but sort of the timelines, the notifications, the factors that go into it are subject to bargaining. So each of our negotiated agreements with each of our 5 units would have some language surrounding those processes. Also going into that would be like another layer we haven't talked about today is there's the budget and the math part, and then Mr. Shockney and his team has to put together what school schedules might look like with X number of sources versus Y. And then once you have a sense of, okay, this is what the schedule might look like at any level or in any school, then what certifications or what qualifications individual employees might have becomes one more factor in who might need to be moved where. And so on and so forth. And, back to the timelines and how long we would have, and I think Mr. Whistler, somebody said this point earlier, you also would prefer not to move folks multiple years in a row, especially not the same person. So trying to account for all of that is all part of this, this sort of puzzle of trying to put this whole thing together. But at the end of the day, principals do have a say in interviewing final candidates for a position in their school, some of the process has to occur to get to that point of saying, here are the final candidates for this position in your school.
Do you ever worry that we'll have classrooms with like over 30 students then with all this shuffling? Do you think that's going to go up like exponentially, or something that because like we're trying to move teachers around, we're trying to lessen that shortage? Or
I'm happy to say, that's another great question. I'm happy to say that is a Mr. Shockney question.
Yeah, the answer to that is yes. We've been pretty transparent all along as we've been engaging in this work over the last 2 years that a significant concern is very large class sizes, coupled with the potential for reduction in course offerings at the secondary level. So yes, very much so. I think, and time will tell as we can work through the math and brainstorm as to what exactly that's going to look like. But class sizes well north of 30 very much could be a reality in this scenario.
In some places.
And Carroll County's not the only county going through all this. I mean, it is everywhere. And I think that's the part that's frustrating, is because we are hearing what other counties are going through. They're, saying, look, we're having difficulties. I mean, everyone's hearing it. Other counties, they've started closing schools, unfortunately, to try to handle this situation. And I think, because yes, unfortunately, there are people in our community who do make the assumption we don't know what we're doing, but it is statewide that this is difficult for everyone.
And it affects each district a little bit differently, because Blueprint forces us to use the funds that we currently have in a different way to meet new requirements. So depending on how each district formed their budget over the past 10, 15 years, certain districts will have issues with certain parts of the Blueprint and not others, and it could be the exact opposite for another district based on how they budgeted in the past versus how Blueprint requires us to budget.
Okay, I think now we're going to pause that and go back to the FY26 budget factors.
Okay, back to the sort of financial components of the budget. Some of the cost pressures we mentioned. Technology is an area that we've made significant investment in during the pandemic, using federal grant funds. Significant number of devices, laptops were purchased for student one-on-one devices. Those funding opportunities have largely vanished, but the need to replace the devices has not. So that's going to be a pressure for us going forward, looking at how to manage and plan and fund the replacement of those. There's some consideration, some options to be had to look at ways to reduce or to minimize that cost. We've already begun that some. In the current year, there was some decisions to limit the grades that would have the one-on-one devices. So these things are still on the table, looking at which grades, at what cycle we do the replacements will continue to be discussion and more to be had on that. It's a big driver of the costs looking forward.
Yeah, facilities. We wanted to talk about this too. It's been years since we really defined this challenge or this situation, and we have new board members, and we thought it'd be nice to at least revisit the topic. So another place in our budget, we talk about technology every year, and we should. We talk about the challenges in special ed every year, and we should. This one's sort of slipped off the radar a bit over the years. Historically, we had an allotment of funds in our operating budget, so sort of in the most flexible form of funding we have, where Mr. Prokop and his team in facilities could respond to emerging situations in buildings that needed attention. So something that you didn't necessarily walk into a year knowing would happen, but here it is and you have to deal with it. And so I think if you go back to the like the Great Recession sort of time period. At one time, we carried about $2.5 million in funding in Category 6 of the budget that Mr. Prokop had available to address facility or preventative needs in schools. And it didn't happen all at once in FY18, but over the years leading up to FY18, we would take a little bit of that money here or there in a given year as part of an overall strategy to somehow figure out a way to balance our budget. And FY18 was the year where we sort of took the remaining amount of money, and I think it was down to $500,000 at that time. And so we had to, you still have to try to address your facilities. You can't just say, well, we won't fix anything. So our strategy, and at that time it was Superintendent Guthrie was here building the FY18 budget. The strategy he put in place was in lieu of having the funding in the operating budget and hoping that that would be temporary and that there would be a day where revenue would be such that we could begin to restore that funding. But until that can happen, let's try to set up a local capital improvement plan project account and fund it if we could. And so we did do that, and the county government agreed to that. And since then, that is how we've operated for those kinds of needs. And you, the Board of Ed, have self-funded that. But in a non-patterned way. So we set up an initial amount and we said to Mr. Prokop, here's how much money you have, spend it wisely. And when he gets close, he lets me know, and we look at factors in that year's spring budget and we say, okay, it looks like we'll have some year-end surplus or we might have some fund balance. Let's take an action to the Board of Ed to repopulate that account. And that's how this has worked since fiscal year 18. That's not the greatest way to be able to respond quickly to situations that work out. However, it is a great tool, as it were, to plan known projects. So if something is identified and Ray is aware that he has this much money to work with, then it sort of sets up like a less than a state level project, but a little capital project that he can work with. Wanted to bring this conversation back for a couple of reasons, because it sort of hasn't gotten the same due as other topics like technology or special ed. But B, to say, you know, it would be nice to have a little bit of money back in the operating budget someday, because you can be a little more flexible, a little more immediate in responding. At the same time, this hasn't turned out to be the worst thing ever either. It's been a vehicle that we've used, and we've used it effectively, I think. But we probably do need to, maybe even this year, start to consider a more consistent way in which we fund it. If this is how we're gonna function with a CIP, local infrastructure renewal project, we might need to think about a more annualized way of looking at what's available in year-end surplus or fund balance and adding to it in a kind of a routine pattern, instead of use it wisely, Ray, and let us know when it's tight, and we'll see if we can add some funds back to the account.
Do you know how much we are giving to that annually, like an average of the last couple years?
Yeah, so on average, so it's been sporadic. It's been as we needed, but I would say 1 to 2 million if you averaged it.
About that.
Probably across the year's average.
Yeah, so, yeah, Drew's not Mike, so about 1 to 2 million if you averaged it out. And I think that's probably what we're sort of hinting at or suggesting here. If he has a little bit in that project account when we close out fiscal 25, and then we could get on a course where maybe we could add $1 million a year or $1.5 million a year, that would be better than how we've been operating. Or if it's not looking like fiscal 26 might be the year for this, but if we could ever get to a year where we could restore a little bit of operating budget, that's even better. And maybe we would sort of balance those two together. So if we could put, say, and this is just hypothetical, but if we could say put $500,000 in his operating budget, and if we were planning, let's say, to do 1.5 per year, if we could, from fund balance or wherever, maybe then we would say, okay, we could put $500,000 in the operating budget, so we'll aim for more like $1 million instead of $1.5 million in the CIP project. But I think it does merit the conversation to say, if this is how we're going to operate in whole or part, then we need to think very carefully about doing this a little more.
Yeah, it is a little disheartening every year to see the budget. One of those line items is we need 1.2 million to put back into fund balance what we used last year. It's disheartening to see that. it's not really the true intent of that.
Nope.
Moreover, there's so very little put into foundation as it is. And so, peeling off $500,000 or $1 million or $2 million out of foundation, now I could see us doing that if we get the state to change the funding model and they pour more into foundation. But yeah, it's something interesting to discuss. Appreciate the thought.
Yeah, and we'll continue the conversation. So we appreciate the attention and the responsiveness. And Dr. McCabe surprised me by not saying it earlier on the question when Ms. Battaglia said, aren't all school systems in the same situation of having to comply? And Dr. McCabe said, yes, it might vary as to what's the most critical challenge from system to system. Also, what the blueprint doesn't consider, because blueprint's sort of a prospective law policy-wise, but from a compliance piece, fiscally at least, it looks at the money you already have. But it doesn't take a look in your rearview mirror and say what was unique about Carroll County in the years preceding the blueprint versus any other county, and what was unique in Carroll County were the reductions we went through from fiscal 9 to fiscal 17, let's say.
Over 300 positions.
Cut 300 positions out of the school system, so it limits our overall flexibility. This is one of those things as well. There were many things, and it probably gets to the point Dr. McCabe raised in her themes about realistic expectations or managing expectations. There are consequences for each decision, and we have to learn how to move and live through them. And as Mr. Burke flips to this slide, let me preface it. So, like another conversation we want to have, and this is not meant to clang alarm bells and to drive people, to drive people out to public comment or whatever. But I think a legitimate question that you might have, that anyone might have, members of the public might have, was what else can you do? Like, if these are the hard choices of blueprint, what else is there to do? And the honest to goodness truth is, we don't think there's a ton that can be done, but here's a menu of some of those things. And I'll try to frame what I mean by that. Somewhere north of 80% of your operating budget is in staff or in other resource. Maybe they're not Carroll County employees, but they're contracted services. So, for instance, your bus drivers are not your employees, but they drive our students to school. Speech language pathologists in special ed and other areas. Like, when you add all of that up, it's somewhere north of 80% of your operating budget is in human beings. And at the school level, I would estimate probably our teaching workforce is 65, somewhere around that. So 65% of our workforce, I would guess, 60 is teachers. And so it's really hard to not make changes in classrooms when you have to make systemic change. And so often we get the question, well, there must be something else you could do. So what's outside of sort of the blueprint requirements or the blueprint constraints? And the truth is, not a ton, but we're open to the discussion. We're open to having that discussion openly and transparently, and figuring out if there are things that aren't required, we could look at them. But in terms of items that would get you a significant amount of money, these are those kinds of items. So there's not great choices here. There's not something else we could go to necessarily that wouldn't harm our compliance with blueprint, isn't affected by blueprint, but could help smooth some of those blueprint requirements. An outdoor school is an ancillary program. It's not required. Not every school system in Maryland has one. No one would want to cut that or do away with the outdoor school, but that's the kind of choice that's at play here. And maybe there are ways to get to smaller amounts in the budget, but these are the big ticket items, like athletics and extracurriculars. No one would argue that they're not extraordinarily important as part of the child's whole experience in our school system, but they're not things that are required. And to whatever extent you want to, as we move through the process, we could talk about those possibilities. I guess our sort of overall point today is to say there's no great choices here either. These are the kinds of choices that would exist.
And we must be able to fund the things that are required.
Right.
That's where we have to begin. And there's nothing in blueprint about outdoor school or athletics or some of these other things. So when we have to talk about, what our priorities are, it has to be what is required with Blueprint, and then what is required to give our students a free and appropriate education, public education. And those things that's when you have to look at things like how large will we accept our class sizes going to, and how long will we wait before we fix our buildings, our facilities. I mean, when we're having conversations like that, those are the basic building blocks to a public education. These things are outside of that scope. So those are the, difficult conversations that we'll have to have and we'll have to think through. Again, not to think through today, but just putting it out for thought.
And I know a lot of times in the community, we hear the first thing we should cut is central office, and, they call the bloat, but this building itself runs on bare bones.
Yes.
Other counties that are comparable to us, they have much more administrative staff than we do here.
We are one of the lowest in Maryland as far as, central office staff in comparison. So
We're always in competition with Garrett County for dead last.
yes.
And we actually have that comparison in our formal response to the AIB in our Blueprint plan.
Well, when you talked about the period where staff members were cut, a lot of those positions were central office positions because we really valued, not that we didn't value what the central office staff members were contributing, but, we wanted to stay away from the instructional program as much as we could, so we didn't want to have cuts there. And this is concerning, looking at this list of considerations, because each has merit, each has value. I know there was a period of time when we tried to cut some of the music programs, I think, and certainly, the community, shared that they did not want to see that. They really saw the benefit of having their children participate in those activities. And I know certainly there are schools that don't offer that. There are certainly some private schools that don't offer the music programs. That's something that the parents take care of, privately on their own, so to speak. But, public school system, I think the music and the art programs, fine arts, it certainly has its merit. And athletics, again, look at the kids who live, so to speak, for participating in athletics. Not saying that the athletics is over the academics, but again, for those certain kids, that's their motivator.
I remember a time when freshman sports were cut. When I was in high school, we had, freshman football, freshman, wrestling. And I remember when that was cut and how much the community was really upset about that. And athletics and performing arts, those things are really important to students. That's their sense of connection. And then,
In terms of offsetting cuts, kind of going back to that technology piece, is anyone considered online classes, distance learning, how students maybe from one school can connect to the other, language classes, that sort of thing, where you don't have to have that same physicality, pay for that instructor perhaps, technology?
Very much so. I think in our discussions that we've been having through the committee, that's very much a part of a potential solution. Especially when we've talked openly about the potential for a compression of course offerings. Obviously, if we utilize a virtual platform, we might be able to reach more students more strategically with that delivery model, as opposed to offering that same course in person in multiple different places.
and again, that prepares them for college too, because many college classes now are going to the virtual side where you don't have that face-to-face instructor.
Sure.
For the technology, is there a state requirement for what grade has to be 1-to-1?
No.
I would just say that starting in third grade, our students start taking the state assessments that are online. And so we wouldn't want our third graders to lack any exposure to online learning and then go into a course that is supposed to assess or a test that is supposed to assess their learning. And then you have to think, well, are those results valid results? Because, is it that the student didn't know how to access the assessment, or is it that they didn't know the content? So it's always been really important for us to make sure that by third grade, our students can access that state assessment and feel comfortable doing so. So that's all we would have to keep in mind.
So in order to be prepared by third, is the thinking to start in second?
Well, I mean, yes, we currently, even though we don't have one-to-one devices necessarily in all of our K through 2 classes anymore, we still make sure that they have access to the laptops. And even though each student doesn't have their own, the classes still use the laptops regularly, so that by the time they do test in third grade, they feel comfortable.
Yeah, and that was one of the things we had said earlier. I mean, we can't wait to third grade to say, now let's put you in front of the computers. And again, I mean, we still talk about computers and technology like it's something brand new. I mean, kids, they're growing up with it now. I mean, so what we can provide for them in the classroom, I think, would certainly be beneficial. And again, I know one of the things we had talked about was possibly, not having the technology available for K through 2. But again, I am really in support of, trying to get it in prior to third grade so kids can be comfortable with it, so that by the time they are tested, again, they're looking at the content and, the computers aren't, sort of jeopardizing how they perform.
And one last question on that. What's the average lifespan of our devices?
Should be about 5 years, but I think we extend out.
For the student device, I'm looking at my staff, about 4 years. And just to clarify too, in the K-2 classrooms for this year, we reverted back to what we did prior to the pandemic in most elementary schools, in which we had devices on carts, where typically a teacher would sign out the cart for an instructional period of time or blocks of time. So we do make sure our students in K-2 have access. But this year it's different than the access that they've had in the years post-pandemic up to this year. But that was one of the difficult decisions that we made for this year to help balance the budget.
Have we looked at the ratio of high school students who have their own personal computers? Because I know some high schoolers bring in their own computers. If we could offset the cost of providing all computers for high schoolers.
We have looked at that and analyzed the costs of that, as well as how we would function as an institution with allowing that. And at this point, we don't believe that the pros would outweigh the cons. But that's a very good thought, and that's one kind of road we went down for a while.
And again, I think we said too that instructionally, we don't want to really make that a requirement for students to bring in their own. We want to be able to provide the materials for them.
Yeah, because then you got to worry about updates and making sure it's compatible with whatever app that the teacher might be using for learning, and that can be costly for some families.
If I can make a comment, I really appreciate this slide. I don't think the intent was to scare anybody or scare us, and I can only imagine what's being talked about now for those folks tuning in. But I think to look at it from a different lens, it's really important for the community to talk to their state legislators and impress upon them that while the aspects of Blueprint are noble and ideal, one of the most terrible consequences of this is that it takes away the local control of school boards around the county, including Carroll, for us to be able to do things, those that are depicted on that slide. It is very important that the public get involved and urge their legislators to give local boards of education local control. We really need a change in the funding model. More money needs to be poured into foundation, which is the discretionary bucket, so that we can, in Carroll County, decide what's best locally for our Carroll County kids and fund these things in a robust manner. We overspend on special ed more than what's required in our county. We choose to do that. We don't need people in Annapolis telling us how to do it. So while I understand the intent, we really need at the local level discretion and a change in the funding model. So again, I don't want the public to be scared or to think that we're going to cut these programs, but I think it's just really incumbent on the public to get involved and to contact their legislators in Annapolis so that we can get local control and keep these things important to us in our county functioning fully.
And again, that's something I think too that we're hearing throughout the state. I mean, they're really realizing and trying to implement Blueprint that we really do need the flexibility. And I think that's why it's at the top of the list for our MABE priorities. You know, give us that local control so we can make the decisions for our students ourselves.
The superintendents across our state came out with an incredibly positive and great blueprint or guide map for our legislators to follow. That's why I appreciate the work that you've done with your colleagues, superintendents, but we'd love to see a lot of those measures implemented.
If we cut outdoor school athletics and like extracurriculars, is that something that schools won't be able to have at all, or something that's up to like parents to decide for like funding?
It's a good question. So we actually do have a participation fee for most families. There's sort of like equity questions involved with that and what would survive certain complaints in different venues.
It may not be an all or nothing.
Right.
It may be something in between, but we would have to work through that.
So maybe if we had to cut maybe like athletics, we could have maybe a team from the Mount Airy region and have students go there rather than have it like school by school.
Well, that's really into the weeds of what would, what could happen, but, it could, like I said, it could be an all or nothing. It could be some place in between. It would just depend on the amount of funding we need and what each of these programs would represent as far as funding, and then what we would feel comfortable doing with it.
And that's a great point. It also probably should have said, this doesn't solve it either. There's not tens of millions of dollars sitting on that screen in front of you. There's a few millions of dollars. So, but this is also about everything Mr. Whistler said, but then, to the questions which are sure to arise, like, isn't there anything else you could do to make that class size not go to X? Or surely you could find a way to just give that extra percent of, not really, not in a great way. And this would be those kinds of final decision points.
And not to say that it again would create lots of millions of dollars, but like say, for example, the extracurricular activities, I know parents who are desperately want to be involved with the schools and to do extracurricular work and work within the schools. I don't know if it's a liability thing or what's going on with that, but could there be that sort of involvement, with parents even to assist? Has that come up at all?
I think that depends upon whether, like FFA, for example, that is led by a teacher. That is led by the FFA teacher. Drama productions, that's led by the drama teacher. Even though those are some after-school things and they're considered extracurricular, many of those things are facilitated by the person who is certified in that particular area.
Yeah, there's some negotiated agreement concerns with that. We'd honestly, to your point, we'd have some liability issues if we didn't have some oversight and some staffing involved in those processes too.
Well, I was thinking like tutoring after school, that sort of thing. That's not as hands-on as, say, an athletic sort of event, but, just helping out with tutoring, and especially elementary school level, perhaps they can assist with mathematics and so forth. with an oversight, person with oversight as well, but, you know, a thought.
Yeah. Can you make it to the end, or
I
your
can.
voice
I'm
is
good.
good?
We're holding out. There we go. So coming to the home stretch here, move a bit from the ongoing operating side of the budget to some one-time opportunities, as I mentioned. Give a little overview of our fund balance position here. So the board's policy, and with an agreement with the commissioners, allows us to maintain a fund balance generally between 1% to 5%. We ended our fiscal year 2024, as you see there, at about 18.1 million. That was about 4.5% of budget, a little higher, I would say, than our historical level over the last number of years. And so with that, the board recently took action to assign $6 million of fund balance into what will become the proposed fiscal year 26 budget for some specific costs identified. So I'll hit those here in a second. Leaves the fund balance remaining unassigned at about 12.1 million, about 2.9%, so more in the range of where we have historically maintained the level, but that is before any year-end surplus from the current year, fiscal year 25, and we would anticipate some addition from that.
If the public doesn't know, fund balance is like our rainy day fund. So it's really important that folks understand what fund balance is.
Yeah.
And cannot be used for ongoing costs.
Correct. Not a good idea.
So, but it's a great planning tool, and we're appreciative to be able to have that as something we can manage through. So the board's action for the little over 6 million is shown there. These are the items that we anticipate being included in the proposed budget. Primarily some deferred maintenance on this building. Once we took ownership of it, some of the long-term infrastructure needs of this building, able to do that with some one-time funding that doesn't compete with ongoing funding for school projects. We mentioned a few things that could also be in consideration, whether that be the maintenance needs, technology, security, and others. Again, the tricky part here is the ability to identify some needs in a one-time way as opposed to ongoing needs. So any questions there on fund balance? That often gets some attention, and I'm sure it will.
My only concern is I love the Dr. Nancy Grasmick, Towson University Teacher Induction Program. It's going to really help us recruit and get good teachers. But again, this is a one-time thing, and we need to look at possibly digging into fund balance to make that continue and happen if it's possible. But
So the vision there, hopefully, is that if we can get it established and up and running, that then along with Towson and Dr. Grasmick, we would pursue grant funding to sustain it until
Okay.
we move into.
Yeah.
grant
This
funding
is
or
just
even a lower
start out.
cost, good, okay,
Yeah.
great.
So I'll just breeze over this. Basically, this is kind of a recent history, historical look at how we've come into the budget season with presenting the proposed budget at the board's January meeting. But as we've hit on, we're going to instead look at a proposed timeline where we get an opportunity to see the governor's budget, the state budget as it comes out. January 15th is the deadline for that budget. Historically, that's about the time it drops. It's not, we don't anticipate it being early. And so with a few days to digest that and get some analysis on that, we would be in a better position to understand our state revenue picture, be in a position to bring the superintendent's proposed budget to the board at a additional January board meeting slated for late January 29th. And then subject to how significant the changes are from what we're developing to what might happen, we would foresee holding the public hearing and a board work session the first week of February, with then coming back to the board at the board meeting on February 12th. If the changes are reasonable enough through what we find and what comes out of the board public hearing and work session, we'd potentially be ready for adoption with that February meeting. If they're significant or the discussions and options and challenges push us to draw it out a bit, we could have more discussion there and come back with a later board session for adoption. Our hard deadline is March 1st when it's due to the county. So there's, at the board's discretion and direction during January and February how we can get there. This was our proposal to delay a bit the process, but still bring it in, under what we're required to do. So I think these dates have pretty much been put on calendars and slated, but I'll leave it, to you all for your direction.
Is there any concern about the items not included, having your arms wrapped around them by February 26th, March 1st-ish? Like, obviously, the employee compensation, that should be pretty well buttoned up, but some of these additional blueprint requirements and infrastructure needs?
Yeah, there's concern about the items before that even. So sort of step one for us is to really get as refined as we can on what those inflationary numbers are, because we're going back to that early slide of $13.3 million in projected revenue at this point. And so we want to refine the what we call preliminary expenditures, I think, in the PowerPoint. But those are really the factors that are driven by kind of inflationary or cost of doing business items, because we need to know, okay, if 13.3 million is the number, do those inflationary impact, what are they? Are they 13.3 million? Are they less than 13.3 million? Are they more than 13.3 million? Because that drives everything beyond that. So if once we have refined numbers on those preliminary expenditures and we're right at projected revenue, there's not much else to do with the rest of the PowerPoint. So what the superintendent has to do is be prioritized, hit it into that moment so that she knows these would be the things I would do in this order. We'll have that from her, and we'll line it up for that now January 29th board meeting to say, here's the budget she proposes. And it's really, and this actually this leads to a great point for the public in general, because I think this confuses some folks. The way the budget process evolves here is it's Dr. McCabe's proposed budget on January 29th on this timeline, and at that moment, it becomes part of a process that leads to your budget, and those are really two different things. She's doing her best to make you a recommendation. You're the Board of Ed and can come up with your own budget on probably February 12th, and that's the requested number that goes to the county. So I think to your question, Ms. Zimmer, we have cost estimates for all of those things. It's just a matter of budget, of balancing expected revenue, what it costs just to stay open, and then what's left for those priorities based on how the superintendent would rank them.
And I'm also understanding that it's not realistic to be expecting relief from Annapolis if session is only going to be a month in by the time.
No.
Yeah, I don't think we can bank on it.
We
that's for
have to
sure.
be prepared to do what we need to do to keep CCPS open and operational for next year.
I do think what will happen in Annapolis will help shape our capital budget talks later on in the summer. But especially with the pre-K and all that other stuff. But yeah, I don't think there's any relief in sight now.
That is such a shame.
It is, but I know that the sense of urgency. We've been calling for a sense of urgency for 2 years, and everyone thought we were crazy. Everyone thought we were fear-mongering, but the entire state now sees it. So at least hopefully we'll see some action.
Well, this was even right during COVID, right when they were talking about blueprint, and then COVID happened, of course. But I mean, even then, they were. Former Superintendent Dr. Lockhart was called, sounding the alarm on it, like, this is going to be really hard to do.
Yeah. Yep. And the more information we received, the more it kind of sunk in, the restricted nature of the
Yeah.
funding and how it really asks us to take the way we've been budgeting for all of these years to afford everything we can afford in the system and restructure
Right.
completely to be able to meet certain funding requirements now. All right,
Is that it?
thank you.
Thank you.
And we will be looking forward to our upcoming meetings to continue the conversations.
Hope everyone has a happy holiday.
Yes,
Happy
happy
holiday, everyone.
holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.